Hey guys, it's Kai from Lucas Lane and Royals. Hope you're doing well. If you're thinking about setting up an enclosure for your very first ball python, or you have an existing enclosure that you want to improve, then stick around. This video is for you. Hey guys, so I know there are already many videos on this topic. In fact, when I encounter someone who's new to this hobby, I often refer them to those videos, but that new person may come back to me with additional questions. I do welcome those questions. I know that that means that person is doing their research, but I also know that that person didn't find the answers that they were looking for in those other videos. What I want to do in this video is show you some options to setting up a ball python enclosure and give reasons why you may or may not want to take certain actions and why you may or may not want to use certain materials and products. Before we move on any further, I want to ask you to keep an open mind and don't let arrogance cloud your judgment. Even after watching this video and doing your own research, be prepared to continue to learn because there's always room for improvement. The best thing to do is to find somebody local who is experienced and has a positive attitude who's willing to mentor you. The reason I say that person should be local is because not everything can be explained in this hobby. Sometimes the best thing is to get hands-on experience. I also suggest you make friends in this hobby. They don't always have to be more experienced than you. They just have to have a common interest and a positive outlook. It just makes this journey more enjoyable when you're with good company. So with that out of the way, let's get on to setting up a ball python enclosure.
All right, so we'll start off at my pet store and we're looking at glass aquariums. So if you come to a pet store, one of the options that you have that the staff will recommend to you are glass aquariums, and they're pretty inexpensive. This one is a 10-gallon tank and you can see it's $15. A lot of times Petco will have these $1 per gallon sales, so that 10-gallon tank will actually be about $10. And coming down here, you see there's a 20-gallon high, which runs $40. And up here there is a 20-gallon long, which also runs $40, but during the sale these will actually be $20. So that's a huge discount and a lot of savings there. You have some other big ones down here. This is a 55-gallon tank and that runs $140. So during the sale it'll be $55. Now those are a bit big for a single ball python. I would probably go with a 20-gallon long or a 10-gallon if you're just growing a small hatchling out to a decent size and then switching them to a 20-gallon long. One of the issues with these aquariums is, well, it's made out of glass. Glass doesn't really hold temperature that well, and also you can see these are open tops. So in order for you to keep a reptile in here, you would have to get a top, and those tops, I'll show you what they look like. They're just made out of like this mesh, metal mesh, and they're still pretty much open tops. They're not going to retain heat or humidity for you, but I'll show you what they look like. So over here we have the lids that I was mentioning to you, and they are made out of metal and they have a mesh to them. They do very little in terms of retaining heat and humidity. They do come in various sizes. You just have to get the right one for the enclosure that you buy. This one up here is a 20-gallon long or a 29-gallon tank lid. And down here we have different sizes. This one is for a 20. And then over here, this one probably is the one we're looking for, and that is the 10-gallon. So yep, so the prices on these are not too bad. We have a 10-gallon for $12.99. I've actually seen these go as $6, $6.99. You will need clips for those, so let me go ahead and show you what those look like. So it took me a little time to find these clips, and look where they're at. They put them right behind the lids, which makes sense for everything to be together, but it was covered up. And these are made by Imaginarium, and they run about $5. I know other brands have them too, and they come in different shapes, different sizes, depending on what you need. They pretty much all do the same job, which is to hold the lid down to the fish tank itself. So if we're looking at Frankensteining something using a fish tank and these lids and the clips, you're looking about $20 to $25 out of your own pocket to Frankenstein something, but you're running into issues with this open top, and like I said, I'll get into that a little bit later. Next up, we have terrarium. So this is the other option that a staff member will recommend when you come to a pet store like this. And you can see this one is a medium, and what's good about these is that they have the doors in the front, so it's easier access. The bottom 3 or 4 inches is still watertight, so you can still put wet items in there. It won't leak or anything. But this one runs, let's see if we can find a price, almost $130. But this looks to be about a 20 or 30 gallon enclosure, so it wasn't a really fair comparison to the 10 gallon one that we talked about Frankensteining together. So down here is something that is a better comparison because it is also 10 gallons, but the price of this is almost double what we can do when we Frankenstein something together. And problem with this is it still has this open top situation. So all they've done is basically affixed a mesh top to a glass aquarium. So you're still running into the same issue as the Frankenstein version, and the Frankenstein version costs about half the price. So some of the other options that you have are something like this. This is pretty tall. I mean, it comes with a bunch of stuff in here. It looks like they packaged it up. This one is $150. Over here, something that doesn't have as many items in it. Looks like it still has some things, and this one is $85. But this is more for, I guess, arboreal animals. And you can see this. They have a picture of a little gecko in there. Well, these type of enclosures are good for animals that need the height. We have some other options in here. Again, these are all just glass aquariums that basically they have added a mesh top to it, and they come with some accessories. They have several other options in here, but what I'm getting at is these are glass, and you can basically Frankenstein something together yourself for much, much cheaper. Or you have something like this, which is designed for reptiles. Also like this, again, they're designed for reptiles, and you get that opening in the front for easier access, and you don't have the mesh top that allows all the heat and humidity to escape. But you're looking at a pretty hefty price tag there. So those are your two options. Most people opt for the Frankenstein version or opt for this if they don't want to have the top that is completely removable. These, I think, slide out, so a little bit better access, but again, you have that open top.
I'll give you some possible solutions in dealing with open tops, but there is another option that pet stores don't readily tell you, and that is plastic tubs. These tubs are inexpensive and they work great for ball pythons, but there's an obvious drawback. They just don't look good. I don't want this video to be about glass aquariums versus plastic tubs. They could both work, but depending on your situation and the environment that you live in, it could take a lot of work or very little work to meet the ideal conditions for your ball pythons. Glass aquariums, terrariums, plastic tubs, they could all work. So let's just set that aside for now. We'll make that decision a little bit later because that's really just personal preference. Let's consider how to meet the ideal conditions. I'm going to start with heating. Ball pythons need heat to perform bodily functions such as digestion. There's two ways to go about heating your ball python enclosure. First way is to maintain ambient temperature to about 85 degrees Fahrenheit. That means you're going to have to crank up the temperature in your house, which seems a little overkill. The other option is to use a small room or closet with a space heater. Now, not a lot of people want to dedicate an entire room to just one snake, and sticking a display enclosure in a closet where nobody can see seems a little silly. Quick warning, some space heaters are prone to failure and can probably cause more damage than any good. Another way to provide proper heating is to use a temperature gradient. Ball pythons can regulate their own temperature, but in order for them to do so, they need a warm side and a cool side. The warm side should be about 88 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, while the cool side can be about 78 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. This can be achieved with the use of a heat mat. You want the heat mat to be appropriately sized. It should be about 1/3 the footprint of the enclosure.
I am here in the reptile section, reptile accessory section at a pet store, and this is what you're going to need in terms of heating. This is what I would recommend you using as a start. So these are heat pads, and you can see they're fairly thin. They just adhere to the bottom of your enclosure on the outside, not the inside of the enclosure, but on the outside. And they range from 1 to 5 gallons, 10 to 20, 30 to 40, 50 to 60, and the price tag on these, they're not that cheap, but they're not extremely expensive either. So since we're Frankensteining something together for a 10-gallon tank, this is the size you'll want to use. And you know, this is $21. You can probably find something cheaper online, but it's not going to run that much cheaper. So with these, like I said, you just stick them on the outside, and they're supposed to heat up to like an optimal temperature. I think that's kind of what they say, but not that they're unreliable, but they're inaccurate. So what you'll want to do is also get something that can control the amount of heat that's produced by one of these things. So if we look over here past all these lighting fixtures and bulbs and heat lamps, you got some UV bulbs. Anyway, these you can, again, just pass over, because your ball python is not going to require light. If you put a light fixture on your enclosure, you can certainly do that, but it's mostly for you, so you can observe the animal. And there's plenty of different bulbs. You don't have to get these here that are specifically designed for reptiles. Well, at least they say they're designed for reptiles. So for your ball python, you can use fluorescent lights, you can use incandescent lights, you can use LEDs. I wouldn't recommend getting it from here. They're just more expensive because they have that little reptile picture on it, making you think that it's for reptiles and amphibians and whatnot. You can get them from like Home Depot or Lowe's. So now we move over here. So this is what I was saying about controlling the heat that's outputted by those heat pads. So you have something like this. This is a little bit expensive, but definitely worth it. You know, your animal is gonna probably cost much more than $62. They have other options. Well, this one is not. This one is just a controller for lights and timers and things like that. So you'll definitely want something like this. This seems to be the only option here right now. You guys know, if you watch any of my videos, you guys know I use the STC-1000, which is something that you have to wire up yourself. And if you're not comfortable with doing that, then yeah, buying something off the shelf is definitely your option. But if you like to wire something up, I mean, the STC costs about $8 to $12 depending on who you buy it from, and I get mine from Amazon and eBay. And you can take a look at my videos on how I wire those up. It's pretty simple, but again, if you're not comfortable with that, then I suggest you buying something off the shelf. So one of the other things that you'll need is a thermometer. Something like this is fairly inexpensive. It's only $11, and I heard they're pretty accurate for the price that you're paying them. These, I would say, stay away from. Even though the temperature controller that I showed you earlier has a dial on there so you can tweak the temperature, they may or may not be perfectly accurate, and it's good just in case this fails. It's good to have something else that's also reading the temperature. So I would suggest adding another thermometer into the tank or the enclosure. This only measures temperature. If you go to Home Depot, you can get something that measures temperature and humidity. and it's not that much more expensive. It's probably like $12 to $15. So that's a better deal. And humidity is an important factor when setting up a ball python enclosure, so you'll need a humidity, something that reads humidity anyway. Alright, so I am still at the store. I'm going to try to show you how to set this up at the store. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to take anything out of the packaging. One of the items that I forgot to tell you is you'll need a temp gun, so a temperature gun. They don't sell them here, but you can easily find them at Home Depot and Lowe's for about $12. So they're inexpensive, but they're really good at measuring temperature precisely. So what I'm going to do here is you have to use your imagination a little bit. This heat mat is rated for 10 to 20 gallons. And you'll want a mat that is going to be about 1/3 of the tanks. Pretend that I take this out of the packaging and there's adhesive on the bottom. You'll peel that adhesive off and you'll stick the heat mat to the bottom of the tank. So essentially you'll have a tank sitting on top of your heat mat like that. And you'll have to make it look pretty. So this is what it's going to look like. Heat mat also comes with 4 little feet that you'll stick to the corners, the bottom corners of the tank. That'll elevate it just enough so that the cord doesn't get crimped and squished underneath the glass tank. So this, you can see, it is about 1/3 of the tank, and you'll hook up this outlet to the temperature controller, and then you'll dial in that temperature controller to roughly 90 degrees, because that's where you want your hot side to be. And you'll also have your thermometer and humidity meter reader also in here as an added precaution, so you can glance at it to check what the temperature humidity are in the tank. But while you're dialing this heat mat in, you'll want to use the heat gun, and you'll want to aim it on top of the heat mat to make sure that whatever you set your temperature controller to be is the actual reading that you're getting in the tank. Now, what the reading is in the tank above the heat mat, that area right there, that is more important to be at 90 degrees than the setting that you put your controller on. So your controller could be 80 degrees, it could be 100 degrees. As long as that area inside is reading about 90 degrees, then you're all set. Because really what's inside is what matters to the animal. The animal is not going to care what you set your controller at. It needs the 90 degrees in order to perform its bodily functions such as digestion. So once you've dialed in the heat on the warm side, we can talk about how to optimize the temperature on the cool side. So on here, you'll want to keep it around 78, 79, 80 degrees, something in that range. This is where that temperature thermometer from Home Depot really comes in handy, because you'll just have it sit here on, obviously, and you'll have the heat mat on as well. And what will happen is that heat will come up and gradually move over to the cool side, but it's never going to be as warm as the heat side, as the warm side, because that's where your heat source is. So you'll want to wait a few hours, maybe even a day, and read the thermometer and see what it says on the screen. Again, you'll want it to be around 78, 80 degrees, something in that range. If it's a little too low, that probably means you'll want to cover the top a little bit, and you have to play around with it. Cover it with, I don't know, some people use styrofoam, some people just use a towel just to cover that open top. Remember, this is an open top. Cover it so that it'll retain some of the heat inside, so you don't get so much heat loss coming out through the top. Now, if your temperature is too high, what you'll do is, and this is a more drastic change, temperature is too high, you can either get a smaller heat mat. Even though this one says 10 to 20, you saw earlier there's 1 to 5 gallon. You might want to get a smaller one and use that, because what'll happen with the smaller one is that it'll heat up a smaller area, and therefore that heat travels a further distance to the cool side. So because it's traveling a further distance, there's going to be less heat making its way all the way to the cool side, and therefore it'll be able to drop your temperature. So the other option that you have, instead of decreasing the size of the heat mat, you would just increase the size of the enclosure. So you can see that that one is a 20-gallon tank, it's 20-gallon long, and it is about 30% longer than the 10-gallon tank. So the same principle, you would put the heat mat underneath the 20-gallon on one side here, and because there is a greater distance from the heat source to the cool side, there's going to be enough heat loss so that once it gets to here, it won't be as warm, and therefore cooling down the cool side to the point that you need it to be. And with something this long, you have a little bit more flexibility, because even though the opposite end of the warm side, we call it the cool side, but even if this side goes to like, I don't know, 74, 75 degrees, that's okay, because the ball python can figure out where its optimal area is for what it wants, for where it wants to be. So if this over here is even like 70 degrees, but somewhere along this area is 77 to 80 degrees, and it wants to be in that area, it'll sit here. And if it wants to go somewhere warmer to digest its food, let's say, it'll go all the way over to here, because that heat mat is underneath this side. So the larger the enclosure, there is a benefit to having a longer enclosure, but the drawback is also because the drawback to that is you'll have so much space that small ball pythons like hatchlings might feel a little insecure with having such a large area to be roaming around. You might think that's a good thing, but in reality they just feel scared because it's so big. You can counteract that by just adding a lot of clutter, like a lot of hides, a lot of decorations and things like that, and then it'll feel a little bit more secure because there's a lot of coverage for it. So it's kind of like keeping away or hiding from large predators, and that's kind of their instinct.
Once you've established a proper temperature gradient, the next condition you'll want to meet is humidity. Humidity should be about 55 to 65%.
To demonstrate how to set up for humidity, I'm using this plastic tub that I pulled out of my rack. But it doesn't matter if you're using plastic tubs or glass aquariums, the principle is the same. You have your heat source on one side, and you have the device which measures both temperature and humidity, and you can see what they are in my room right now. And you plop that somewhere in the middle. Then you go about putting the cover on. If you have a aquarium, then you put your mesh cover on, and if you had to put towels on or styrofoam on to keep the temperature in it, you would do that. With the tub, same thing, you put the lid on, and if you had to drill holes or anything, obviously you would maintain the same number of holes. You don't want to change anything from what you did when you calibrated for temperature. What we want to do now is just get the baseline for your humidity reading. So you put everything back to the way it was, you turn on your heat mat, and you put in a bowl of water. So this is empty, but you would have a full bowl of water. Put everything back and just walk away. Walk away, come back the next day and see what it reads. See what the humidity reads. So if you're in range, which is the 55 to 65 mark, and it's okay if you're a little bit high, even up to like 70, 72-ish.
If the humidity is too high, you'll need to reduce it. And a cheap way to go about that is by adding some ventilation. However, ventilation will impact the temperature that we worked so hard to calibrate. Another more costly way to go about this is to use a dehumidifier. Again, it's costly, so it might not be a viable option here. Luckily, in the States, we don't deal with high humidity. And to be honest, if your humidity is a little bit higher than 65, it's still in the safe range.
But like I said, most of us here in the States, we fight low humidity. Just like you read right here, you see I am in the range between 45 and 51. So I'm not close to the 55 to 65 range. So I'll be fighting low humidity here. One thing you can do to fight low humidity is because this is going to be a bowl of water, move it closer to the heat source. Come back the next day, see if your humidity increased a little bit. If it did, great. If it's still not in range, just keep moving it closer and closer to the heat source. You don't want to completely cover up the heat source, but you can move it closer and closer or directly on it. The warmth from the heating element will help the water evaporate quicker. So that'll add humidity to the enclosure. So that's one method to increase humidity. The other method to increase humidity is with the use of substrate.
Some substrates affect humidity greatly, while others have absolutely no impact. All substrates have their own pros and cons, so we'll be looking at each one of them, and then you can determine which one you can use best to combat your humidity issues. Let's start with newspaper. Newspaper is great because it's free, but it doesn't do much for humidity. You can always wet it down, but since it doesn't retain the moisture, it'll quickly evaporate and you're just left with low humidity again. Also, wet newspaper will sometimes transfer the ink to your snake, so it might not be that appealing when you have a light color snake like an albino. I once got freaked out when one of my snakes got a red belly and I thought it was a burn. Turned out it was just the magenta color ink that rubbed off. The next option is unprinted newspaper. You can buy it off of Amazon or eBay, and it has the same qualities as regular newspaper, it just doesn't have the drawback of the ink rubbing off. Something a little bit more easily attainable are paper towels. All three of these paper options do very little for humidity. You can mist them down, but they quickly evaporate.
So I am back at the pet store to tell you about the next type of substrate, which is something like this. This is more synthetic. This one is made to look like grass, and it's pretty cool. This one is made to look like dirt or sand. I have no experience in using these. I'm not a fan of washing and reusing substrate, although I can imagine there's some cost savings in doing that. But because we're talking about humidity, I don't imagine these are able to hold humidity well. Looks like there's just some fabric with a rubber lining underneath it. This lining is probably there just to keep it from sliding around. There are other ones as well that are made out of felt and fabric. Again, you want to wash and reuse those, which I'm not a fan of doing. I don't imagine any of those holding that much moisture. And since we're talking about humidity, they're probably not good options to sustain humidity. So here are the felt ones that I was talking about. I'm not sure they are felt, but just touching them, they kind of feel like scrub pads, the kind you use to, wash your dishes. I'm sure they're not as abrasive. It actually says non-abrasive up here. So you got some options here, different colors. Over here there is another more coarser one than the one that we saw earlier. This looks more like dirt, whereas the other one we saw looked more like sand. And it does look like they don't stand up to the test of time, because this one has been completely rubbed off by maybe another customer. But anyway, so you got some options with the synthetic stuff. You got some prices up here in case you are interested in using these. Again, I don't have an experience with these, but you're free to try it out. It doesn't hurt to test and just experience for yourself what works and what doesn't work. So moving on from the synthetic type, we have something more organic, and you can see this is a setup that the store provided. Over here you got this dual layer with leaves and then some kind of organic matter underneath it. This one is aspen all the way through, and this one looks like it's bark. So you do have some options here, and there's more than just these. Let me see if I can find some more for you. So over here are a couple other options. You got forest floor, which looks like it's some kind of looks like it's mulch almost. It's got that mulch consistency. So that's forest floor. And then you have down here, this is a coconut husk. So this brand is called Tropic Cocoa Husk. There's other brands, I'll show you the one that I use in a moment. But this is just coconut husk that's been crushed up. You'll want to be careful not to use something too fine. It will get into the animal's respiratory system, and that's not good. There's some other ones where you can buy these that's packaged, and it's like this. This is again, it's dual layer. So just like before, we had leaves and some kind of bark underneath it. This one is fine looking coconut substrate with the coarse on top, and it kind of just gives it a nice look. But again, this fine stuff might not be great for your animal, especially ball pythons. I've tried it and it does get into their heat pits, so I'm not sure if that's a good thing. I imagine it to not be good, so I would stay away from those. And then over here we have aspen, which I've used before. I didn't have any problems with using aspen. This is a finer aspen. You can take a look at the how fine it is, and this is what was on the display earlier. And then over here you have something that's a little bit more coarse. This looks like wood shavings. It's almost the same consistency as you would find to be in like rodents, for keeping rodents. So you can see a big chunk right there. I would go with this stuff. It's a little bit coarser, but both of them have worked for me in the past. And what I would say is that these organic substrate do hold moisture a little bit better than newspaper, but aspen, especially the finer stuff, over time with prolonged conditions of it being wet, it will mold over time. This same thing. What I found that is a little bit more resistant to mold is the coconut husk. It will still mold because it's organic, obviously, but it's a little bit more resistant to it, and it does a better job at retaining the moisture. So it's really porous and it'll really soak it in there, and it releases the moisture a lot slower than, say, newspaper, or definitely a lot slower than newspaper, and a little bit slower than the aspen. So those are your options with the substrate. There's also other ones. You do have to be a little bit more careful with going with organic stuff because, for example, pine. You don't want to use pine because there's an oil in there that's toxic, so you have to do a little bit more research. But when you're in a store, a pet store like this, and you're looking through these products, there's definitely labels on there. There's definitely pictures on there, so that'll help you gauge as to what is appropriate for your animal. With that said, depending on how you're trying to battle humidity, that's something that you'll need to also factor in, because like I said, some hold moisture better than others, and they are more resistant to mold better than others. So you got a lot of choices. You'll just have to come and figure things out. A little bit of trial and error might be needed in order to get that perfect optimal substrate for the optimal humidity in your enclosure.
Now, there's no silver bullet for getting the right humidity. It's going to vary from person to person, and that's because we all live in different areas. In fact, your house and your neighbor's house will have different levels of humidity. Your room and the room next door may even have different levels of humidity. In my situation, the basement, I expected to have higher levels of humidity than upstairs, but in actuality, the opposite is true. I actually have to run a dehumidifier upstairs to remove humidity, and downstairs I have to run a humidifier to add to the humidity. Now that still doesn't make sense to me, but it is what it is. Some people may tell you that they don't even consider humidity, and they might be one of the few lucky people who live in an area or a room that have humidity already in the range that ball pythons like. Now, not all of us can be that lucky. So if you do have to adjust humidity, it's a bit of a trial and error process. However, picking the right substrate can be the first step to getting that perfect humidity level. Now, hides are not absolutely necessary, but they do offer the snake a sense of security. So you can go ahead and add one to the warm side and add one to the cool side. Other things like fake plants and branches are totally optional, but they do make the enclosure more appealing. And since it's your enclosure, go ahead and have fun with it and be creative.
Now, as far as decoration goes, you can come to the accessory section of your pet store and take a look at the variety of decorations that they have, and you can pick and choose what goes into your tank. So these are all This one feels like plastic and made out of plastic and resin. Same thing with these, which are great because things don't grow on them. Things like mold and germs, they're not going to really grow on these. They're not a source of food for those type of organisms. These are plastic. They're not going to deteriorate, so you can actually take these and wash them out if they do get dirty, which is great. Something like this is organic. This is wood or some type of wood. These are, I don't think these are real. I think these are, again, are made out of some kind of resin. But organic stuff like this, and let's see, there's something over here that I saw, these hides. These are just logs that have been cut in half and hollowed out. You know, they look really nice because they are natural looking, but again, if your animal goes to the bathroom on these, and obviously this part, these two ends are going to be sitting in maybe a wet or moist substrate, over time there's going to be mold and mildew and things, other organisms growing on it. They're just in the environment. There's nothing you can do to prevent them from growing, and it'll just be a constant dirty area for your snake to burrow in, and it's going to want to burrow. It's going to want to be in a hide, so it's always going to be in contact with something that gets funky over time. So these are not a good idea. These are probably not a good idea either because they're organic. They're just hollowed out pieces of wood or bark. I wouldn't recommend using anything like this. There are other things like these hides. This one's kind of small. This will be good for a little hatchling, but you can definitely find them in different sizes. You got some fake rocks here. They also double as a hide. So these are going to be great because the animal can, you know, do its thing. They're not going to rot or deteriorate. They're not going to grow germs, and if they do, you can wash them off. So I'm a bit of a fish guy, so I know that there are other decorations in the fish section that are not available for some reason in the snake section. Now these are all safe for fish, which to me means that they're going to be safe for snakes as well, but you do have to be careful because snakes might get stuck in something really tiny like this. So just know that these are for fish. This one's really cool. It's got a skull there, and I'm pretty sure your snake can go in and out of that. It's got a large hole up top. So for hatchlings, they probably use this as a hide. Over here are some of that fake wood that I was talking about. Couldn't find these in the snake section, but reptile section, but they're over here in the fish section. You got some other options up here. Really cool, very realistic looking, at least in my mind. But yeah, you got some other options over here. So take a look in the fish section and see what works for you. You might want to clutter your enclosure, especially if it's a large enclosure for a small hatchling. That clutter actually makes them feel more secure. It's got plenty of hiding spaces for them to move around and not feel threatened that they're going to get eaten by a large predator. Of course, once that hatchling starts to grow bigger, you can just remove some of the clutter and free up that footprint to allow them more space to roam. So that's pretty much it in terms of decoration. You have plenty of options, so you know, just use your imagination. Now in the reptile accessory section, you will also find these little water bowls, and they have a naturalistic look to them even though they're made out of resin or plastic, and they have different shapes. This one looks like rock, this one looks like a log, and they have, like I said, different shape. This one fits into the corner, nice and neat, doesn't take up as much space. And then you have little tiny ones. So these are really small. They're probably not great for ball pythons. What you want is something larger, something that they can not only drink out of, but also like crawl through if they needed to. This one is probably too big for my taste, and this will probably take up like half of the space of a 10-gallon tank. So that's a little bit too big. What I like to do, instead of getting something from the reptile section, now here's another one. Again, a bit big. But what I like to do is, instead of picking out a water bowl from this section, I like to go to like the dog bowls and cat bowls section. So we're over here by the dog section, and you can see there's a wide variety of dog bowls available, and there's a lot of different shapes. I like to avoid things like this where the snake can go underneath and then push up to flip the bowl over. What I like to look for is something like this in shape. This might not be ideal, visually appealing, but you know, this is the shape that I'm looking for. It's got a nice wide base, so the animal can't tip it over. They don't have the ability to crawl underneath it. Something like this is also a good choice because it's nice and heavy. Again, once it's filled with water, it's even more weight, so the animal is not going to be able to tip that over. Let's see. Something more generic looking without dogs or cat pictures on it, if you're not into that kind of stuff. This is a good size. This looks to be about 8 inches. This one looks to be about a little bit smaller, maybe like 6 inches. But they can basically last for the entire life of the animal, anywhere from hatchling all the way up to adult size. I would probably go with this one, and it's running about $12.99. I'm sure you can find it cheaper online or at a different store. Try going to Walmart, try going to Christmas Tree. Dollar store, I know, have the plastic ones, but they are kind of flimsy looking in my opinion. They did have the ceramic ones at one point, which is the ones that I use, but they don't sell them anymore, unfortunately. So if this isn't your style, you can certainly look elsewhere, but for me, this seems to be the most economical, and they're functional as well.
I'm a bit of a minimalist, so here's how I would set up an enclosure. You can add more decorative items. Just remember, the more you put in, the more you have to clean. Considering it's a display enclosure, you want it to look nice. The extra cleaning may be a fair trade-off. Ideally, you'll want to set up the enclosure well before getting a ball python. So this is a pretty basic setup. What I have here, if you can imagine, the warm side. So the heat mat will be sitting underneath the tank on this side, making that the warm side. And for a hide, this is just Tupperware that I cut a notch into, and that just goes on the warm side. Of course, I did the same thing on the cool side. This is kind of optional, but if your snake is new, it's small, and it wants to regulate its temperature, this will allow it to go from the warm side to the cool side and still have that feeling of security because it has the hides to hide under. I have a bowl here. Of course, you're going to fill this with water and position it to wherever suits your needs. I also have a device here that measures both temperature and humidity. So you're going to keep an eye on this, look at it from time to time. If any of those readings go outside of the range, you're going to know that something in this tank has changed, something might have failed, and you'll have to make adjustments. For substrate, I am using this coconut husk. So there's chunks in here, there's fibers in here, and like I said, this is good for holding moisture and slowly releasing that to elevate the humidity. It's also good for spot cleaning. This particular brand of coconut husk I'm using is by Pro Coco. You can certainly add other decorations to the enclosure, such as plastic plants, rocks, and branches, trunks, things like that. Just make sure those are things that you're able to wash and get them completely cleaned. Of course, that brings us to the next point, which is the more things you add, the more things you have to clean. And this is a plastic tub version. I know it's not exactly pleasing to look at, but this can be a good option as a quarantine enclosure. I purposely used paper because it's more hygienic and easy to see any parasites that the snake might have brought in. Quarantine is a topic I may cover in a future video, so I won't go into it right now. Let's take a look at this setup that is in a plastic tub. I have a hide on top of the warm side. I have a device that reads both temperature and humidity, and I have a water bowl. So instead of loose substrate, I've decided to use, for presentation purposes, unprinted newspaper on top of a couple sheets of printed newspaper, and that just kind of helps stretch the unprinted newspaper out for a little bit longer.
it's more likely that you'll be able to use paper as substrate because this is in a tub. And if you can imagine, once the lid goes on, it's completely solid and it'll be able to hold temperature and humidity much better than an open top glass aquarium. And if your lid is solid, then you probably don't need another hide because it'll be dark on the other side as well. So if the snake does decide to move out, it'll still feel secure in a dark, confined place. This setup may not be too pleasing visually as a display enclosure, but you can definitely use this as a quarantine enclosure. And one of the benefits of using paper is if your snake is carrying any bugs or parasites or mites, they'll easily show up on a white background as opposed to loose substrate like the coconut husk I showed earlier. But if you're comfortable with this enclosure, I'm sure your snake will be as well. So go ahead and use this as your permanent enclosure. Of course, you can still add decorations to make it look even better. For now, I hope this video provides some insight to the options you have to create that perfect ball python enclosure. Remember, there's no one correct way. You'll have to play around with it and learn what works best for you. So consider the options and don't be afraid to change things up and tweak it until it's just right. So that's it for now. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you're new to this channel and you want to be informed of future videos, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. As always, thanks for watching, please share, and I'll see you guys next time.